Hey guys, welcome to lesson 15 of how to make iPhone apps with no programming experience. In this lesson, we are going to add code to keep score for each round for the player and the enemy. Now before we do that though, I created some graphics to improve the look and feel of our app. So I've got a logo here that I'm going to put near the top. I've got a deal button, which I'm going to replace the play round button with, or rather I'm going to add the image to the button. And I created a new background, so it's got this sort of spotlight feel to it rather than just solid green. So let's go ahead and add those graphics to our asset library first. I've got the logo here, so I'm just going to drag that into there. And I've also got the deal button graphic here, so I'm going to drag that there as well. Okay, now let's go into our storyboard. Now to change our button, so in order to add an image to our button, we're going to come here, click the button, go into the inspector pane on the right hand side, and if you scroll down, see there's image and there's background. If you specify background and you pick deal button, you see the image is going to appear there, but the text is going to appear on top of it. So you can either do that and then erase the text, or let me just erase the background, or you can set it as the image. For example, if you wanted, what was it, deal button. For example, if you wanted the image beside some text. So I'm just going to do that, but I'm going to erase the text so that we have a button with just an image right there. But also in viewController.swift, in the viewDidLoad method, we were practicing setting properties and calling methods in here. So this one actually adds the title play. So I need to get rid of this line, or else it's going to add the text play beside my button image. So I don't want a title for my button. Okay, next we need to add an image at the top of our view. So we search for UI image view here. I'm just going to drag it and drop it right there. And now we got to add some constraints to it. So the first thing to be aware about is the size class that we're in right now. Right now we're in the iPhone portrait size class, and I just added this image view onto the storyboard. So this image view, which is the logo, will only be available in this size class. I actually want it to be available in all the size classes. So I'm going to go back to the any width, any height layout for now. And then I'm going to open up my document outline by clicking this button. And then I'm going to, you see how my logo is grayed out right now? Well, I want to include it in this any size class. So I'm going to go into the inspector pane. Let me just expand this Xcode window a little bit. There it is. It's actually in this tab right here. And I'm going to install it into this size class. Now you can see that it's not grayed out. And I'm just going to rename this as logo. And in this size class, I'm going to add a constraint. I'm going to click the image view. And I'm going to horizontally centered in the container. Furthermore, I am going to, in the inspector pane right here, change the image to logo. Now, let's see how it looks when we run it in both portrait and landscape. And then we can, depending on how it looks, we can make some adjustments to it. Okay, so you can see the logo in portrait view, it's up there. It's a little small, and it's also probably needs a margin from the top. And if we go into landscape, you can see the size for landscape actually looks decent. Again, it needs a little margin at the top. So with that in mind, we are going to jump back into our storyboard. Now we're going to go into the portrait, and we're going to add a margin from the top for this logo. So select the logo either from the storyboard or from the document outline. Click this menu here, uncheck constraint to margins, enable that top margin there and click this so that you know which item you're specifying the margin from. So I want to choose view, which is the top, and let's say it is, right now it says 50, it says 44, and I'm just going to leave it at 44. I'm going to click add a constraint, and then furthermore I'm going to add some constraints to the left and right. So let's uncheck constraint to margins and do that again, and double check what the neighbors are. So 80 and 80 gives me something that looks like that. So I'm just going to add those two constraints. Now I'm going to run it just to see how it looks in portrait. So the constraints that I just installed were in the portrait size class, so it's only going to show up for the portrait. Okay, so as you can see, there's a margin from the top, and because there's margins from the left and right, it is pulling it wide, but however the aspect ratio for my image is kind of messed up now, and I can change that with a simple change of a property. If I click the image, if I go to the attribute inspector pane, I look at the view mode, it says scale to fill. Instead, I want to do aspect fill, which means that it's going to stretch the image to fill the container of the image view, except that it's going to maintain the aspect ratio. So that's going to prevent my image from getting squished. So if I run it again, now it looks proper. It looks like the correct height and width. However, I do want to extend that margin a little more from the top. So let's go back into the document outline. Actually, it's probably easier to select that exact constraint I need from here. And here we can see that it was 44 before. Let's change it to 100. And then let's click that and update all the frames for all the views. Okay. And you can see here that it's kind of clipped after I updated the frames, and that's because the image view doesn't actually have a height. See, I specified a left and a right margin, I specified a top margin, but without a bottom margin and without a height constraint, it doesn't know how tall this image view is. When I run the app in the simulator, why isn't it clipped like this? Well, that's because in the image view, the image is going to overflow unless I specify clip subviews. So let me check this off and I'll show you what that looks like. So I'm going to run it again, and you're going to see that now the image is clipped because it's not going to overflow its container. However, if I uncheck clip subviews, and by default it's unchecked. So you only need to enable it if for some reason you want to clip the subviews. So now it looks fine. Now I could specify a height for this guy if I wanted to, but I don't feel the need to right now because it looks fine in our simulator. It works fine. However, when we go to landscape, we still need to specify a top margin so that it's not as close to the top. So let's jump to our landscape size class, and for the logo I'm going to select it from the document outline. Click this, uncheck constraint to margins, check the neighbor is the view, and then let's say it is 30. Press tab, add a constraint. Now let's run it. Alright, so that looks pretty good. That's landscape. And this is portrait. Okay, now what we also have to do is add scoring labels. So let's go back to the any size class. Let's search for label down here and drag a label, just put it in the corner there. And what we're going to do in the attributes is we're going to change the color to white. We're going to change the label to maybe a 0 to represent the score. We're going to change the alignment to center aligned. And we're going to click this icon, this little T right here, and change the size to about 100. Okay, so the labels is going to be as big as it needs. I'm going to specify a left and a bottom constraint for this guy. So I'm going to uncheck constraint to margins. For the left, let's say 50. For the bottom, let's say 50 as well. And I'm going to install these constraints on the any size class. So it's going to affect both landscape and portrait. Now let's click this, select update frames, and there we go. Actually 50 might be a little too much, so let's change that to 20 and change that bottom one to 20 as well. Okay, and now let's just run it quickly to see how that looks. Okay, so there we go. That's in landscape and that's in portrait. Okay, we are going to also add another label kind of right on top of that 0 there, and make sure that it's not sitting on top of the frame of that other label, because we're going to highlight both of them, and you can do that by either selecting the 0 on the document outline and then holding down Command and selecting the other one, or you can do that through the storyboard. So click the 0, hold down Command on your keyboard, and then click the label so you have both of them selected. And then we're going to click this alignment, and we're going to say horizontal centers. That means they're both going to be horizontally aligned like that. And then also we're going to select that label, which is going to be the player label. We're going to hit the pin menu, uncheck constraint to margins, and specify a bottom margin. For the neighbor, we want to specify that it is relative to the score label. And if you don't see this score label, that means that your label is overlapping the 0 frame, so that it can't detect this neighbor. So what you would want to do in that case is just move it a little higher up if you can't see it, and then try it again. So click the pin, uncheck constraint to margins, enable the bottom margin, select the 0 label as the neighbor, and then let's put 15. Press tab to tab out of that text box and add constraint. Now let's update all of the frames. So you can see that the label sits right on top of that 0. What we're going to do is change the properties for that label. Let's go change the text color to white, change it to player. Let's center align it, and now let's run the app. Okay, so we can see that there's the player label right there, and it looks okay in landscape as well. So we need to add another corresponding set of labels on the right hand side. Okay, so let's stop the project, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply highlight both of these and hit Command D to duplicate them, and then I'm going to move them on this side right here. So I'm going to create a little more space. I'm just going to make my Xcode window a little larger. So I'm going to drag this all the way on this side. I'm going to highlight this score label, and I'm going to add constraints, uncheck constraint to margins, enable the right and bottom. Just make sure that they're relative to the view, and then add 2 constraints. So it looks like there's a constraint there, and I believe it might already have the horizontal centers as well, which is this one. So let me just change this label. I'm going to click that label and change the text. You can actually double click the label to edit the text right there. So let's say enemy, and now let's run the app again. Okay, it looks good. We've got the app in portrait view here, and that's landscape view. The next step is to hook up these score labels to the code, to the view controller as IB outlet properties, so that whenever we click deal, we can actually write code in the play tapped method to update these 2 labels with the corresponding score. So I'm going to stop it, And in here, we want to go into Assistant Editor. So that's this button up here. And because we're losing a lot of real estate for the storyboard, I'm actually just going to do it from the document outline here. So I can see that this 0 label is the player's score, and this 0 here is the enemy's score. So I'm going to click that, hold down Control, click and drag it over here. Oops. Let's cancel that and try again. I'm going to put that right here. And I'm going to call this the player score label. Press enter. So now we've got one outlet property. Create a little space so it's just easier to drag the line. I'm going to click this one here. That's the enemy score label. Hold down Control. Drag it into there. And I'm going to call this the enemy score label. Okay, so now we have access to these two elements on our storyboard. Another thing we want to do is actually create two properties up here to keep track of the scores, and they're going to be integers. So let's say var player score is an int, that's a capital I, equals 0, and right here we're going to say var enemy score is 0 as well to start off with. And now if we scroll down to play round tapped, let's create a little more space so it's easier to read. I'm going to go back into the standard editor, and then we're going to jump into the view controller. So if you remember from the last lesson, we created this if statement. In this branch, the first card is larger, so I want to increment the player score. Right, player score, let's use self to remain consistent. You don't need to use self, but this just refers to this view controller's class's property named player score. So to increment, I'm going to use plus equals 1. So that's just going to increment the player score by 1. So if the numbers are equal, I'm not going to do anything. If else the second card is larger, I'm going to say self dot enemy score plus equals 1. So I'm incrementing these variables which are keeping track of the score, but I haven't updated the labels yet. So in order to update the labels, we can reference them because we created IB outlet properties. So self dot player score label dot text. Labels have a text property which we can update, which sets the text for the label. I'm going to say equal to a new string object, and I'm going to pass in the player score. It's going to actually turn that into a string object, and it's going to assign it to that. I'm going to do the same thing for the enemy label, self dot enemy score label dot text equals new string object, and we'll pass in the enemy score this time. And now let's run the project, and we should be able to see the score updating as we press deal. Okay, so let's click deal. So the ace is larger than the 10, so the enemy score incremented. Now king beats 8, so the player score incremented. So we can see it's working pretty well. Let's go into landscape view. So that looks great. So that's the war card game. I hope you guys had fun with it, and I hope you guys have learned a lot as well. I had a blast teaching you guys how to build it, and I hope to see you guys in the next lesson. Alright, bye for now.